Hello friends and welcome back to Luffy Fiction. How are you all? So in this video we will see part 2 of what if Luffy manifested the dragonic place in hell. Now without any further delay let's continue the story. It's a thought that's been revolving around her mind ever since Garp had given her that basic guidebook about marines. It's a silly and stupid and really crazy idea, but there's a kind of sense to it that makes it look insanely acceptable if you tilted your head just right and squinted your eyes to get a better look at it. And, to be completely frank about her current problem, she blames Garp about it. It's an unfair judgment, she admits, since her grandfather hadn't yet suggested it or decided, like in the original series with the original Luffy, that she'd make one hell of a marine instead of a stupid pirate, and all he'd done was plant a tiny seed of what if in her head. But she has to admit though, if Garp had actually planned to influence her, a baby girl, albeit a baby girl with an adult woman's mind from a different dimension and knows the future, by making good use of her love for books to become a marine, he was doing a splendidly good job, because now she was starting to have doubts if whether or not becoming a pirate was a good choice and if whether or not becoming a marine was the right choice. It's all so very confusing. She's weighed out the pros and cons of both sides. Pirates live a life full of freedom, whether it be filled with debauchery or not. They had a choice to do whatever they wanted to if they had the courage and prowess to do it. Unrestricted by the laws of the world government, they were free to do whatever they want. Sail throughout the seemingly endless seas, search for treasure buried by people long dead and gone, ransack each other's ships, party the entire night and drink beer until their livers crumbled in defeat, or heck, even take over an entire kingdom. They could do whatever the hell they wanted, and get away with it because they were considered outlaws. And it was seemingly their right to do whatever they wanted to. They could kill and take and destroy whenever they wanted to if they so pleased. Marines, on the other hand, are held back by laws of the world government. It was their job to both eliminate the threat of piracy and contain the wrongdoings of not only the pirates but also of any activist group against the world government. They fought in the name of the justice they believed in, and they were loyal to the cause. Unlike the pirates scattered about, the Marines were regarded as one organization that were branched out to almost every single island located within all 4 blues and of the Grand Line as well, and they had the legal power to get things done, whether it be by sanitary or dirty methods. Pirates could be ruthless, but so could Marines. Pirates could be selfish bastards, but so could Marines. Prates could kill and take and destroy, but so could Marines. Marines could be kind, but so could pirates. Marines could be pacifistic people, but so could pirates. Marines could protect and give and restore, but so could pirates. Both had its good and bad, and she'd seen it all through a screen. She'd seen the beauties and ruins both sides left in their wake. She knows that she cannot just decide which side to pick out of a whim because this is real. Gone was the fiction she'd come to admire. Now, people with powers bordering on the supernatural zone, an inhabited world filled with islands with kingdoms instead of countries, and beings that one could only imagine were roaming the very surface of the earth right this instant were real, and she had to have a plan to survive. Sure, she could always pick the easy way out by becoming a civilian and taking up the job as village healer to make a living and maybe settle down with someone who could handle her if there was even anybody out there who could, considering she'd lived in 6 states in her previous life yet found no significant other. But was that really option? Did she really want to live another plain and boring life when there was clearly a much more exciting path just laid out for her? There had always been something missing in her past life. Nothing sentimental like she felt as if she was born in the wrong world, because right now that was clearly what she was feeling, in a body that shouldn't even be hers in the first place and a name she felt like she didn't even have the right to own. It was more of a boredom. Yes, a boredom. A specifically psychotic kind of boredom that had stemmed from her everyday routine. She couldn't really explain it into words, but it was like there was something wrapped around her very soul, slowly suffocating her as the days passed by and she continued on with her normal life as a doctor, with nothing new or special happening in quite a while aside from the new cases that would pop out every now and then. Heck, she even stopped celebrating her birthday by the time she entered medical school. Basically, she felt like she was caged in her past life, with the key to open the lock dangling right in front of her face. She had the choice to take it, of course, to free herself from such a dull life. But she never wanted to deal with the consequences of her parents yelling in her ears. telling her what a waste of money she'd been and that she should have just found a man to take care of her, of the people she'd met whispering behind her back about how shocking she'd turned her life upside down, of the stress and fear and anxiousness of being labeled as useless, digging deeply in the back of her mind as both a warning and a push for her to not give up on her current way of living. So she'd put on her big girl panties and carried on, because what else could she do? That is, until her death came, and suddenly the key hadn't been the only thing to free her from her prison. Her death was more like an explosion, an impact that bent the metal bars around her until there was a spacing large enough for her slip through and escape. Her death was a godsend, to be honest, and though she'd miss her family, her friends, and the good old patients who didn't hesitate in giving her extra tips or gifts, she was just glad that she'd managed to get out of her ordinary life without having to face the consequences of everyone's disappointment, herself including, bearing down on her. Even though that meant she had a new whole warehouse of consequences just sitting right in front of her with her new life. But hey, beggars can't be choosers, right? So now, here she is, deciding her future and wondering if whether or not she should go along with the storyline or go beep it and join the Marines. It's not an easy decision, she can assure you, and it takes her another half hour for a thought, no, a memory, a realization, to enter her thoughts. And then, she makes up her mind. She's snapped out of her daydreaming with a shudder when she hears a platter of something heavy having been placed down in front of her, and she blinks a few times to make sure that the large and wide stack of pancakes, complete with whipped cream at the edges and a handful of it at the very top with slices of strawberries, bananas and blueberries decorating the white cream, isn't a result of her hyperactive imagination. Bawahahaha, happy birthday, Luffy! Her grandfather exclaims loudly, and she yelps when she's suddenly plucked out from her seat and placed on top of his broad shoulders. He tilts his head up to reward her with one of his signature grins that could very well resemble the size of her head, and she can't help grinning back at him because it's her birthday today, and also because her grandfather and the rest of the villagers she's met in her time living with Makino and Melissa are there to celebrate it with her. It's a large contrast from her first birthday, where she'd spent it in the privacy of the room she'd lived for an entire year in and with only the company of her mother and father on that day. Her heart squeezes at the thought of her parents, and she wonders if they're all right wherever they are. You really outdid yourself this time, Makino-chan, the mayor, whoop slap, she heard Melissa yell out loudly to him one day, and a barrage of memories of a cranky old man always berating Luffy that becoming a pirate would be no good for the village had surged through her mind. Praised Makino with an eye of admiration at the stack of pancakes. I didn't know how to make a cake, so this was the next best thing, Makino answers, before she looks up at her and gives her an apologetic smile. I'm sorry, Luffy. I wanted to make a cake for you, but I couldn't get my hands on a recipe. I hope this will do for now, Makino says whilst clasping her hands together and giving her a hopeful look. She can't help but feel stunned at Makino's words, especially at the young woman's expectations that she'd be disappointed at having a stack of pancakes as a replacement for a cake for her birthday, and she feels an influx of emotions swell up within her chest as she decides that Makino is definitely the best. Reaching her arms out to her, it's clear what her demands are, and Makino gladly takes her into her arms after Garp bends down on his knees to accommodate the barmaid. She pats Makino on the cheek and gives her a beep there before mischievously blowing a raspberry into it, making the young woman flinch in surprise. Luffy! Makino exclaims out of surprise, and she looks hilarious with a smudge of spit on her cheek and with her dark eyes so wide. She laughs at Makino. Makino neighs funny, she says as childishly as she can, because she has an act to keep up, okay? I don't need a cake to be happy. I have Poppy and you and Melissa Obaa and Whoop Ojii and everyone else here, and pancakes too. I don't need anything else. She grins widely as she wraps her arms around Makino's neck and gives the young woman a squeezing hug before she pulls away. Makino neighs really the best, she exclaims one last time to assure the one who's been looking after her the most for an entire year. She can see the tears building up in Makino's eyes with how glossy they're becoming as the young woman gazes down at her with a wrecked expression on her face. Oh, Luffy. Makino murmurs softly, her delicate hand coming up to comb through the short spikes of her dark hair that have yet to lengthen. She leans into the touch, of course, and goes in for the kill. I love you, Makino ne, she says, and she means it. She loves the young woman with all her heart, comes to adore how hard-working Makino is every day and never fails to do her work with a bright smile playing on her lips, how Makino's able to get up after a particularly hurtful scolding from Melissa and still keep moving forward, And how considerate Makino is of everyone's needs that she even sometimes forgets about her own well-being. Because Makino deserves to be loved, deserves to be cherished. A tear drop slips out of the corner of one of Makino's eyes, and she watches as it trails down her guardian's smooth cheek and drip down on her blouse from her chin. Several other drops of tears soon follow after the first, and she feels a little panicked because she didn't mean to make Makino cry. She just wanted Makino to feel that everything she's done for her is more than enough and that she appreciates her for all the things she's done for her. She's crushed into Makino's chest before she even notices, and she blinks a few times to get her bearings in order. However, she doesn't pull away because she can feel Makino trembling as she hugs her tightly. Instead, she tilts her head back to look up at the young woman, who's looking down at her with a, dare she name it, loving expression on her face. Makino's tears drip down onto her face, but she doesn't wipe it away because she feels that if she even moves, even breathes, then the moment in between them would be ruined. Finally, Makino's lips curve upward into a teary smile that just twists her heart. "I love you too, Luffy," she says, before planting a beep on her forehead. She feels her cheeks heat up Makino's words, but the moment is ruined when she feels something wet and loud being blowed onto her forehead. With a shriek, Luffy leans away as far away as she can from Makino, who's grinning triumphantly down at her. "Ew!" Luffy cries out, wiping away the saliva on her forehead and grimacing at the large amount of saliva that sticks in between her fingers and covers the entirety of her palm. "Makino ne," she complains, before wiping the young woman's spit on her blouse. "You're so yucky." She sticks out her tongue at Makino, who giggles. "Now you know how I feel," is Makino's teasing reply as she wipes her tear-stained cheeks with a handkerchief. Before she can even garner a response, she feels large hands hooking themselves underneath her armpits to lift her up from Makino's arms and plant her small body on top of broad shoulders. "Poppy," she cries out, curling her fingers into his cropped hair and pulling as much as she could of it. The fact that he didn't even wince was a sore blow to her strength, but considering that she was just a tiny 2-year-old girl, it's to be expected that she could hardly make a veteran soldier wince even if she kicked him in the balls. "Where's my I love you too, Luffy?" Garp demands from her. "I love Poppy too," she exclaims, grinning widely. "I love Poppy so much," she cheers, and she screams out a protest when Garp plucks her from her spot on his shoulder to blow a raspberry on her stomach. "No, Poppy, no, not you too," she cries out with laughter, only managing to push her grandfather's face away from her body with a well-aimed kick to his face that hardly phases the man. Torturing the poor girl, Melissa clucks her tongue. "What a miserable lot you are," Melissa comments half-heartedly before she easily steals her away from Garp. "And you," Melissa says pointedly to her, and she reflexively shrinks back, and she supposes that if she has dog ears then they would be folded against her head. "Who taught you to do such a thing? Proper ladies don't blow raspberries," Melissa says in a scolding tone, aged features twisted into a sharp glower. Instinctively, she raises her arm up to point at her grandfather. "Poppy taught me," she beams, "even if that's a lie and it was Whoop Slap who did, but hey, nobody needed to know that. The mayor would stop sneaking hard candy to her if she ever blabbered out that he was anything but the strict old man that he was. And besides, it didn't look as if Garp knew the truth either. Bawahahahaha. Lighten up, Melissa. Luffy can be a proper lady while being fun too. If she's all prim and proper, she'd grow up to be a stingy old hag like you." He laughs, beating his chest, and looking as if he'd just said the funniest joke in the entire world. Makino easily takes her away from Melissa, who raises her cane and delivers a whack to the back of Garp's head that's so strong that it sends her grandfather to the floor with an evident bump growing on his head. She can't help but stare in awe and admiration at the elderly woman who holds more strength than meets the eye. And so, her second birthday comes to a relatively peaceful end, with her surrounded by new family members and a stack of pancakes that she easily devours whilst everybody isn't looking and is busy trying to pull Melissa away to prevent the elderly woman from ripping out all the hair from Garp's body. She makes a wish when she engulfs the last piece of the stack of pancakes, aware of the eyes that have now settled on her once the chaos has diminished. "I'll become strong to protect these people. Fuchsia Village isn't terribly small in size, nor is it any bigger. It's just the right size for anybody to be familiar enough with everybody that a simple greeting and offer for service would never be considered awkward or too much, in the least." Another factor was that the village was large enough for news to travel by fast. By the time she'd arrived in Fuchsia village with Garp, there wasn't anybody that hadn't known about her by the time dusk had arrived, but not everybody knew that she was directly related to Garp through blood, and most had assumed that she'd been picked up somewhere like he did with Ace. She'd met almost all of the villagers by now, and she was familiar enough with them that she'd accept being carried by them and bounced around the bar under the watchful eye of either Makino or Melissa. Each and every one of them had been kind and nice to her, so it wasn't really that much of a surprise that Melissa would hand her over to the other women of the village to babysit her. But Mistress Makino tries to protest, holding her close to her chest as if to shield her away from anybody else's eyes. Enough, Makino. The kid's old enough for others to babysit her, and it's not like we'll just hand her over to petty mountain bandits, Melissa says with a roll of her eyes. But Makino tries again, and the barmaid looks down at her with reluctance clear on her pretty features. Not knowing what else to do, she brings up a hand to pat her guardian's cheek as a sign of comfort. But it only seems to do the opposite, because Makino looks even more hesitant to give her to Terry, a young woman who'd recently gotten married and seemed to be a close friend of Makino's. She'll be fine, Mako, Terry says, smiling comforting as she holds her arms out to take her. I'll take good care of her. I promise. She'll come back to you in one piece by the end of the day. She reassures Makino, beaming brightly as she does so. It takes about a quarter of an hour before Makino ever so reluctantly hands her over to Terry after a good berating from Melissa and several more reassurances from her friend. Your Makino-ne is really something, ne Luffy-chan. Terry giggles as she carries her out of the bar. She agrees childishly, looking around the village and what else had changed. She blinks owlishly once she notices that one of the one-floored houses near the bar had gained a second floor, and she wonders why. Looking up at Terry, she asks her, why did the house get bigger? Whilst pointing at the house in question. Huh? Terry stops walking and looks over at the house. Oh, you mean Kokoi and Sharon's house? Well, they had Brock add a second floor because they found out that they'll be having a baby soon. Terry smiles softly at the house, warmth seeping into her eyes. She recognizes the look on Terry's face. She's seen in it on her female friends' faces, on the faces of women who'd once been her patients, and even on her younger sister's face after she'd gotten married to a wonderful man. It's the undeniable look of a woman who longs to be a mother. Even she can admit that she's worn a face like that before when she checks up on the children that were once her patients. She may have had a significant lack of a love life, but that doesn't mean she didn't yearn to start a family for herself. She'd planned on getting knocked up a few times from a one-night stand, on those nights she's drunk off her ass with a tub of ice cream and an action movie playing on the television, but she could never do that to her child. A life growing up without a father. She's seen so many children who'd grown up with something missing in their life, and she'd never want her child to go through that. Come along now, Luffy, Terry sighs dreamily. I have a couple of old clothes that I want you to try on. And so, they depart towards Terry's house, and she can't help but feel dread settle deep in her stomach at the very idea of dress up. It goes on like this for a couple of months. Whenever Garp isn't around to take care of her and Makino and Melissa are much too busy in the bar to watch over her, she's passed on to any villager who's willing to take care of her. Whoop Slap is one of the most common volunteers, and she enjoys the time they spend together out on the port, fishing for any fishes or sandals that the waves bring to their little island. He's been nothing but patient with her, answering any of her questions, but she believes that a few of them are lies because when she asks him who her parents are, his reply to her is a shrug and an I don't know that's said too casually and quickly when she clearly knows that he knows who her father is. Still, she lets it slide because having the most wanted criminal in the entire world as her father should be a well-kept secret, and she supposes that Whoop Slap had assumed that she'd blurt out her father's name the very next day even if she promises to him that she'd keep it a secret. The original Luffy would, maybe, but not her, so she can't fault Whoop Slap for assuming that what with the blood of her insane grandfather coursing through her veins. And it's a funny thing, really, that when you're passed on to a variety of people to be taken care of, you tend to get influenced by them. By being separated from Makino and Melissa, she learns how to socialize with these people, and from them, she learns how to live an islander's life. It's not a hands-on experience kind of learning, considering that she's only 2 for goodness' sake and the rest of the villagers would rather tie her up than let her do something remotely dangerous or straining for an infant her age. No, She learns through sight and hearing alone.
She listens to their words, to their offhand advices, and she watches them work, how to handle such things that she's never thought of handling before since she'd had everyday services that she could just pay for, such as tailoring, carpentering, farming, fishing, milking, and, most of all, laundering without a freaking laundry machine.
She needs to learn how to do these things herself, because who else would do it for her? Makino could, of course, and Whoop Slap too, but she needs to learn how to be independent from them soon enough because she doesn't want to be such a burden to them for so long. She doesn't want to become even more of a hindrance to their lives as she is now. So she resumes her act as an innocent albeit exuberant baby girl, whilst all the while learning the practical methods to survive this new and big, wide world that could easily kill her. One of her greatest fears happens one day, on an ordinary day where you'll expect that nothing will go wrong. The weather is perfect, with not a gray cloud in sight, and the sun's rays are hot to the head, but the cool sensation of the ocean's breeze is enough to keep anyone from complaining about the heat. Business at the bar is slow at best, with only a couple of customers that request for food than alcoholic beverages. She's on the bar counter with Melissa seated directly in front of her, and Makino is busying herself by preparing the customers' orders right behind her. The owner of the bar is currently teaching her how to make a crochet before she can go on to knitting then sewing, since girls should start learning how to make clothes for their children as early as possible, or so what Melissa says as she shows her how to make a double crochet stitch that she's doing splendidly horrible at. If you check the meter-length chain stitch, that's the only thing she's managed so far. Then, suddenly, Melissa starts coughing. It only lasts for a few seconds, so she barely pays any heed to it since the old woman has been prone to coughing since a few days ago, and it's only natural for elderly people to be more prone to coughing due to the vast increase of sensitivity to their lungs. But it's when Melissa starts coughing again with her back hunched over from the force of her coughs and a pained expression clear on her face, does she start actually worrying. "Mistress," Makino asks worriedly, hurrying over to her guardian's side and rubbing her on the back. She looks over the counter, and she freezes ever so slightly when she catches sight of something she's oh so familiar with but hasn't seen or even smelled in a long time. The blood that coats Melissa's palm is like an eerie reminder of the smell of blood that had oozed off from her father's clothes on the day her mother had stopped visiting her, and she's practically petrified in place. "I'm fine," Melissa grunts out, trying with all her might to wave off Makino. "It's just a little." She pauses then, eyes going wide before she hunches over once again to start coughing out a lung. The coughing this time doesn't stop until after a few minutes, and when it does, Melissa collapses to the ground. She sees Makino's mouth open into a scream, one that never reaches her ears that are too preoccupied with the sourceless ringing that's coming from nowhere but everywhere at the same time. She knows it's a reflex of her tiny and inexperienced body going into shock, considering that she's gone through a handful of it during her early weeks as a surgeon. And she hates it that she freezes up the very moment when she could be helping. Eventually, Soka, a woodcutter and a close friend of Terry's husband, helps Makino bring Melissa up to her bedroom as two other villagers run out of the bar to call for Whoop Slap and the village doctor, Kokoi. Makino is crying. Makino doesn't even bother trying to hide the hideous face she makes as teardrops slip past the corners of her eyes that have already turned pinkish from the amount of time she'd locked the two of them up in her room to unleash all her sorrows. Her entire face is flushed to the point it's starting to resemble the reddish shade of a ripe apple, not to mention the facts that the skin around her eyes are swollen, snot is starting to drip down from her nose, and she's fairly sure that a fair amount of saliva is trailing past Makino's lips. Makino isn't a quiet crier either. When she cries, she screams and shouts and curses. The entire opposite of the Makino she'd come to know, who's always so calm and composed and serene and generally tame. Each wail that comes out of Makino's throat cracks her heart just a little bit, and she's oddly reminded of the time when her father had gathered her up in his arms, the suffocating scent of death and blood emanating from his very being, and just held her there as his shoulders shook and the Adam's apple in his throat had bobbed up and down. But unlike then, she's able to do something this time. Appearances be damned, her act as a naive and innocent and bubbly 2-year-old be beeped into the mouth of hell, because she won't be so useless this time around when one of her precious people is suffering and she can do something to rectify that matter. Not again. Definitely not again. She moves out of the corner she'd begun hiding in the moment Makino had started throwing things around, and climbs onto the only bed in the room to where Makino had thrown herself on to mute her sobs and weeps into a pillow she'd stuffed her face into.
Slowly, and a little cautiously, she crawls over to Makino and plants her rump right next to Makino's head.
The woman who's older in terms of physical appearances pays her no heed as she continues crying into her pillow. Still, she reaches over and combs her fingers through Makino's dark green locks, and she starts humming a small lullaby that's one of the only mementos she has left of her mother aside from the memories they'd shared together and the shared blood flowing through her tiny veins. She knows the lyrics very well, having listened to it to the very end before sleep could completely take over her weary mind, but she can't sing it very well, so she opts to hum it for Makino, who deserves to at least hear the melody of this song until she's old enough and has practiced enough to actually sing the lyrics to her. Eventually, Makino calms down the very moment her throat is starting to feel hoarse, and the older woman looks up at her with dark eyes that are completely void of emotion. Yet, Makino still manages to force herself to smile kindly at her, which makes her heart crack even more because Makino's so strong, so giving, so considerate even when she's at her lowest. "Thank you, Luffy," Makino says, her voice so broken yet still managing to come out in one piece.
Her chest is tight, and she can tell that her hands are clenched into tight fists when she feels her nails digging into the skin of the palms of her hand. Her entire head is both a whirlwind of thoughts and filled with absolutely nothing at the same time, but there's one thing that's clear through the storm of emotions that fluctuates within her.
"I'll fix things, Makino ne," she says with resolution in her voice, and the emotion that wells up within her when she says it is familiar. It's a psychotic kind of determination, one that she's lived with for a very long time, and one that's brought her to her doom yet made it so much easier for her to breathe. Makino doesn't believe her. She can't blame her, because who would believe a 2-year-old girl claiming to fix something that should be incomprehensible to an infant her age when even those who are at least 10 times her senior can't understand the solution to the problem itself? Yet, Makino brings her hand up to caress her cheek in a loving and most affectionate way that makes her chest tighten even more. "If only, Luffy," she says with a defeated sigh. "But this is something you just can't fix," is her last words before she gathers her into her chest and wraps her arms around her petite frame. No more words are exchanged as Makino falls asleep, but she stays wide awake as she stares at Makino's chest. Melissa is dying. Her elderly body is succumbing to a disease that the village doctor is familiar with but doesn't know how to cure. The only option they have is to bring Melissa to the Goa Kingdom, where the medical facilities there are much more advanced compared to the one they have here in Fuchsia Village, but even that's not the smartest of decisions considering it'd cost a lot of money. And even the patient herself had verbally denied being such a burden to their wallets despite the several decent arguments that Melissa deserves every pouch full of belly they have on them for all the good and favors she's done for them. But she's familiar with Melissa's disease. She can't cure it, what with their limited amount of resources and the lack of modern equipment to better aid her, but she can slow it down. Just long enough for Melissa to live for another year or two so that old age can claim her before that accursed sickness can. Melissa's dying, but she can fix it. She'll fix it this time around, unlike that time her mother had to leave her and her father and she had no idea how to fix that. She'll be strong enough this time around to protect her loved ones, because never again will she be so useless in the face of hopelessness. It takes an entire week of wasting time, before she can execute her plan. Makino is tired and weary, but she doesn't seem stressed enough to have another mental and emotional breakdown. Melissa's been sleeping for most of the day, waking up every now and then, before going right back to sleep after she's eaten her designated meal of the day. Whoop Slap comes by every day to check in on them, bringing along hard candies and half a freezer full of freshly caught seafood or their monthly supply of milk, and also to bring her to her designated babysitter of the day, considering that all 3 of them are either too sick or preoccupied with their duties to properly take care of her. For an entire week, she's thrown a fake tantrum 4 times. None of those were her best moments, but hey, you can't always get what you want unless you throw one hell of a tantrum with screeching, crying and hair pulling. The only reason for why she's ruining her image as an easy baby to take care of is because she needed someone in particular to take care of her. Or, well, that someone's house to be more specific. Sharon has been a fantastic and patient babysitter for her for the past week. Albeit she was a bit clueless with how to take care of her at first, and also she had one hell of a temper tantrum that was thankfully from the source of her mood swings from being pregnant, and her husband usually bore the brunt of her irritation. Fortunately for her, Sharon was prone to taking naps with her and would always be the first one to fall asleep and was a heavy sleeper herself, making it possible for her to sneak out of bed and barge into Koko's clinic when the doctor wasn't home or had joined them in sleeping as well. She's seen the notes he'd written down, and, while all of them were detailed to the point, even she was impressed with the knowledge he had despite the limited amount of resources he had in his shelf. What he was identifying as Melissa's sickness was all wrong. Melissa doesn't have a respiratory disease, she has a cardiovascular one. Yes, she's been coughing out blood lately, has been feverish for the past few days, and has been complaining that her chest has been hurting, which could all point out to a problem in the lungs or bronchioles. But Melissa's been favoring her right side more than her left one and has complained about it a few times. She's been looking a tad bit yellowish in the skin, which could hint to deteriorating red blood cells, but it's the fungal-like deformation in her nails that hits the nail spot on that. It's her heart that's having problems, and that her respiratory system is also bearing the brunt of the damage. She's already listed down all the things she'd need, packed a bag full of supplies that would surely help keep her alive, and left a letter on the counter for Makino once she wakes up. It's probably about an hour past midnight by the time she checks up on Melissa, and she makes sure that she closes the door as quietly as she can, wincing every time a particularly loud creak resounds from its rusty hinges. She makes sure to be as careful she can as she climbs the bed of the woman she's starting to see as her foster and always grumpy grandmother. She looms over Melissa, taking in the old woman's relaxed features that are usually wrinkled into a scowl with furrowed eyebrows. She smiles. Sadly, happily, relieved, worried, she has no idea, and, hesitantly, she places a tiny hand on Melissa's cheek to touch the skin that's still warm. Quickly, she places a chaste beep on Melissa's forehead before she clambers down the bed and heads out of the room, making sure to pick up her pack that's at least twice her size before she climbs down the stairs and runs as fast as she can out of the bar before anybody else can catch sight of her tiny figure retreating to the dangerous outskirts of Fuchsia Village. And if anybody sees tears running down her cheeks, it's merely a trick of the moonlight, because she doesn't cry, damn it. She's absolutely petrified. Several times, she's already thought about going back to where home is, where Makino is, where safety is, and far, far away from this insane jungle where a young girl her age shouldn't even be a mile's worth of distance within. But she couldn't do that. She couldn't just give up so easily and go back home where Melissa was sickly and pale and practically living the last few months, maybe even weeks, maybe even days, of her life, and suffering from a disease that nobody in Fuchsia Village but her has any knowledge about. It's the only thought of Melissa, still warm to the touch, that makes her put on her big girl panties and brave through the jungle where creatures at least thrice the size of her grandfather roam about even in the dead of night. She's already encountered at least a pack of wolves, 3 wild boars, Godzilla Jr. if it was ever a tiger, and a spider that could have probably passed off as a freaking Ariados with its color scheme and how beeping large it was. All of which she's ran away from via climbing. Or, well, shimmying up considering how beeping short her limbs are. Trees bless Garp for letting her do whatever she wanted to do when he was home, or simply running away. She's probably pissed herself silly a couple of times, but she never really bothered to check if she did what with how tired she's been. And to think, she's barely spent 3 hours in this insane jungle and she's already survived several life and death situations that she could have gladly lived on in peace without. She's frustrated, tired and hungry, and all she really wants to do is to open one of her containers of food and gorge in, but she can't beeping do that because there's a giant-ass tiger down below that could sniff her out any time if she so much as twitches from her perch on a branch that she's sure that stupid tiger can reach if it just stood on its hind legs. So far, she hasn't found any of the herbs she'll need to create the homemade remedies for Melissa's sickness, but she has found a couple of mint and chamomile herbs lying around and she couldn't help cutting a few stalks out because they'd make exceptionally good ingredients for teas and soups that would be beneficial for Melissa's health as well. Still, she has hope that she'll be able to find what she'll need. Because she needs those herbs to help Melissa, and come hell or high water, she'll find those stupid herbs. Makino wakes up from a dreamless sleep at exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, just as she's always had to, right before the sun's rays can peek over the horizon and before that rooster from next door can crow out its morning alarm. With puffy eyes and cheeks stiff from tears, she sits up, stretches, and yawns loudly with a mouth to cover her mouth. Her head is still cloudy, and she takes a minute to recollect her memories of last night. Immediately, her mood becomes somber at the remembrance of her mistress's health. Mistress Melissa has always been cranky and strict with her, and there was never a day that had gone by on the first early weeks of being placed underneath Melissa's care where she wouldn't ruthlessly criticize every single thing she'd done to the point Makino would cry herself to sleep. But her mistress is a good woman, and that is enough for Makino. She'd been the one who'd taken her in when there was nobody who would. The one who nursed her back to health when she was painfully sick for days, then berated her for not looking after herself properly. The one who'd given her clothes that were never hand-me-downs but sewed by hand. The one who would always chase away the customers who'd gotten too handsy with her, then scold her for not sticking up for herself like always. The one who'd taught her everything she knew today, such as reading and writing and math and common sense, for her to not be some girl with no brains. The one who'd cared enough for her that if her mistress would have to die, then she'd be left with the bar and a hefty amount of belly that was more than enough for some troublesome barmaid she'd picked off the streets to get by. Mistress Melissa has always felt more of a mother than her real mother who she'd hardly gotten to know of. And now, Makino couldn't help but think with a fresh batch of tears building behind her eyes, she'll be gone soon. Suddenly, Makino's jolted out of her own thoughts at the realization of something. Patting the area to her left, she snaps her alarmed gaze to the space that's empty. More specifically, empty of Luffy. Makino inspects her tiny bedroom, even going so far as to check underneath the bed and peek into her wooden chest of clothes. Yet, there's no sign of her 2-year-old charge. Frankly, Makino is panicking. Well, on the inside she is. But she swiftly pushes that down because panicking won't do her any good and Luffy is probably downstairs, in the bar, where the door to the outside world is conveniently there and she could just waltz right through those swinging doors and venture off into the night where some kind of childnapper could steal her away. Or maybe venture off into the port where she could trip and drown herself in the ocean because Makino's pretty sure Luffy can't swim just yet in. Breathe, she tells herself, inhaling deeply. Breathe, Makino. Now's not the time to be panicking. So, as calmly and as level-headed as she can, Makino makes her way out of her room, climbs down the set of stairs, and arrives down in the bar. At first sight, the bar is sentient of human life. Still, she reins in her worry as she checks around the bar. By the time she'd switched the lights on, checked underneath the bar counter, the tables and the chairs, and even inside the barrels that had been pushed off to the side, Makino is sure that her heart's somewhere lodged in the middle of her throat when there's no sign of Luffy anywhere. Just as she's about to call quits and run to the mayor's house for help and for another panic session, Makino spots a sheet of brown paper lying inconspicuously atop the wooden countertop. She feels something akin to dread settle icily within her gut as she picks up the paper and starts skimming the contents of the paper, hoping that this isn't some kind of runaway letter from Luffy. By the time she's finished rereading it for the 12th time, Makino's face is pale and sweaty as her trembling hands crumple the edges of the paper that's starting to form a tiny rip at the very top. She can't find it in herself to even breathe, because right there, scrawled in calligraphy with emphasized curves, are the words, "I'll fix things." Whoop Slap wakes up to a barrage of insistent knocks on his front door. The mayor of Fuchsia Village drowsily grumbles his way to the entrance of his house, and he can't help but take note of how dark the sky still is from outside his window, making his foul mood worsen. He nearly rips off his door as he opens it, a grumpy expression plastered across his face. His mouth opens to unleash a myriad of colorful curses mixed with complaints at how early it is, but he pauses when he realizes that it's Makino. Poor, sweet Makino who really isn't somebody his anger should be directed at after all that's happened to her yesterday, and he promptly swallows down all of his intended words for being woken up at such an early hour. Makino, he voices out instead, and the something clicks in his head when he sees the fresh tears streaming down her red cheeks and the stricken expression that she wears. An eerie kind of dread and remorse settles in his gut at that, and he can't help but ask, is Melissa? Makino looks even more pained at the mention of her guardian, but before she can open her mouth, Whoop Slap places a hand on her shoulder to silence her. It's okay, Makino, he tries to comfort her, understanding how much pain she should be in right now. Losing a loved one had been hard for him, and for Makino who's so young to lose her maternal figure at a time like this must have been even harder. Melissa's in a better place now. It's best if we go to Kokoi and let him handle the rest, he says as he then proceeds to shepherd her towards the direction of where their village doctor's house should be. But then Makino stands firm from where she's at on his porch, and he turns a questioning glance at her. Wah. It's not Mistress Melissa, Makino suddenly says, shaking her head as she bites her lip and silently adds yet. I checked on her earlier and mistress is still sleeping, she informs him, much to his confusion. Then why did you wake me up? Whoop Slap asks, flabbergasted and supremely relieved that his old friend hadn't kicked the rusty bucket just yet. Because I can't find Luffy, Makino answers quickly. What? Is all that manages to come out of Whoop Slap's mouth. As Makino explains the situation to him, about how she'd found the note that Luffy had most likely left, how she had immediately gone over to Sheila's house in case the 2-year-old girl had gone over there to get some medicine, and how Luffy wasn't there. Whoop Slap feels like something akin to dread settle within his guts as he inspects the paper Makino had given to him earlier. It's Luffy's handwriting all right. Nobody could beep up that Z and make it look like a curly G. Have you checked Garp's house yet? He asks the barmaid, who immediately turns on her heel and runs off to the aforementioned location without so much as a single word. The mayor watches as Makino disappears around a corner before he goes back in to operate the Den Mushi Garp had left for emergencies use only. As he waits for Garp to answer the irritating rings, Whoop Slap's thoughts drift off to unpleasant thoughts of what could become of the Vice Admiral's granddaughter. Pirates rarely came by Fuchsia Village, but it wasn't quite unheard of to hear of at least one crew within the Kingdom of Goa, and considering the frighteningly short distance between his little town and the large kingdom, it wouldn't be quite unheard of for a pirate to stumble into their village and coincidentally kidnap a child, who they could have very well threatened to write a letter as to not raise any alarms, that they could either keep as a deckboy or sell off to slave traders. A shudder crawls up his spine at the thought of slaves. He'd seen them once, a few decades ago in the Goa kingdom, when a Tenryubito had dropped by with a line of slaves accompanying him. His memory is a little fuzzy and blurry around the edges, but he clearly remembers the expressions they wore that time. Every single one of them had looked as if they had all lost the will to keep on living. And the very thought of Luffy, bright, cheerful, and lively Luffy, with gaunt features, bony limbs, and her eyes so empty makes goosebumps pop out all over his skin. When the ringing continues on for several more minutes, Whoop Slap curses Garp for being so far away from them right now when they need him the most. There's a snake crawling on the tree. It's nothing like any of those small, insignificant garden snakes that she and her sister would fearfully cower away from whenever their father would mischievously show it to them. In fact, this particular snake seems to be twice as thick as her waist and thrice her size in length, with bright shades coloring its scales and beady black eyes that are trained solely on her. As it opens its mouth, revealing a forked tongue and a pair of fangs that glints threateningly from underneath the rays of the sun and could easily be half the size of her entire arm, she thinks that this type of snake is worth cowering away from. Her tiny arms are wrapped around the thick trunk of the tree. She's trying her best to press as much of herself as she can. The snake is just a few meters away from her, on another branch that's dangerously close to hers and could easily be bypassed if it just lunged forward. Climbing down isn't an option for her, not with the pack wolves prowling underneath her branch, so that only leaves shimmying her way up to the branch above her. Yet, her muscles are frozen in place and she can't seem to find it in herself to move. Her heart seems to be the only part of her body that's functioning well, a little too well, judging by how fast it's beating and how determined it seems to jump straight out of her throat. She watches with fear locking her joints as the large snake raises itself, the strong muscles underneath its scales tensing as it leans backward and opens its mouth wider, a hiss audibly leaving its throat as it appears to be preparing itself for lunging straight at her. She can see a vicious kind of hunger in the snake's eyes, but there is something else as well, desperation, and she doesn't know why or even how, but she can see it through the snake's orbs that brings true meaning to the quote. Eyes are the very windows to a being's soul, and she knows that this snake is merely hungry, after days of having digested nothing. And there's a small part of her that feels sad for it if it wasn't for the very fact that she's its next meal. Terrified, she manages to find it in herself to whimper pathetically. Is this how she'll end, after 2 beeping years of cozying up to this new life? A life that shouldn't even be hers and has the majority of the story of One Piece on its shoulders. What will happen then, she wonders, to not only her but to the entire storyline itself? Will she be reincarnated in a different body and in a different time and world, once again? Or will she truly die this time around? And what will happen to all the people who Luffy would influence, would save? What will happen to not only her but to them? Is this how it will end for her this time, with a snake devouring her whole after having sunk its fangs into her flesh for a bloody taste? And after a long time, she starts to relearn how to fear death. However, Just as the snake ferociously launches at her with wide jaws, a blur of dark brown suddenly appears from the thick foliage above their heads, and it barrels into the snake with enough force that makes a sickening crack resound throughout the air. It takes her a moment for both her body and mind to realize that she's no longer in danger. Gradually, she starts to relax. Her heart dislodges itself from her throat and its beating returns back to its normal and steady pace. She takes in a breath that she hasn't known she's been holding, immediately filling her lungs with much-needed oxygen. Her body is still shaking from the entire ordeal. Otherwise, she's mostly unharmed. She winces when she unwraps her arms from the tree and sees how red the palms of her hands are from gripping the bark as tight as she could, and she manages to feel silly and stupid for not bolting out of there as fast as she can. Next time, and she can most surely count on there being a next time, she wouldn't be so foolish as to let her nerves take hold of her body once again. The only thing she can use as an excuse for herself for even freezing up in such a dire situation in the first place was because she's never encountered such a large, untrained snake wanting to make her lunch. Suddenly, she feels the branch she's sitting on wobble dangerously up and down, making her swallow down a shriek as her grip on the tree trunk returns despite the incessant throbbing in her fingers. Alarmed, her gaze shoots up, and when her dark eyes meet another pair of dark eyes, she can't help but blink dumbly. A monkey? The aforementioned mammal blinks back at her with, dare she say it, adorably innocent eyes before it reaches out an arm towards her to which she flinches away from. Its arm stops, its fingers just several inches shy from her face, and its head tilts to the side in silent confusion to why she'd reacted so negatively to its touch. She feels her heart melt at the adorable sight before her, and she manages a nervous smile for the monkey that seems to brighten up when it sees her lips curve upwards. She vaguely wonders what has happened to the snake, and one look down at its sickeningly broken and unmoving body confirms it all. Well, hello there, you little sick, rotten piece of scales, she thinks with a tad bit of insanity. But it seems as if she's stared on for far too long because the monkey grabs her attention back by tugging on her backpack, and she looks back at her savior, with raised eyebrows. It takes her a moment to realize what it wants, and she's not one bit hesitant in revealing the contents of her backpack, either in fear of becoming like the snake down below, or in acquiescence since cute animals have always been one of her prime weaknesses. As the monkey rummages through her backpack, she tries hard not to look back down when she hears the pack of wolves growl and bark at the snake's corpse. Instead, she watches as the monkey pulls out one of the sealed containers with food inside of it, sniffs it, and tries to open it before it promptly gives up and starts shaking the container in frustration. Snorting, she reaches out to pry the container out the monkey's grasp before the food inside of it completely turns into mush. Wait, she tells the monkey, who looks amusingly and alarmingly affronted, before she unwraps the handkerchief around the side, digs her nails in the small gap, wrenches the wooden container open, and hands it back to the monkey, whose eyes are wide with wonder and has its mouth puckered out to emphasize its feelings. It stares at the food inside of it and its eyes gleam hungrily. Without pause, it digs in and she's left to watch as the monkey practically inhales her container clean. It looks up at her after it realizes that there's no more food left, and she tells herself not to coo at the monkey's adorably big, dark eyes that stares pleadingly her way. Sir, Fleet Admiral Sengoku, sir. The Marine that had just entered salutes to the highest-ranked officer within the room, his form stiff and the tip of his middle finger just barely brushing against his eyebrow. Garp looks up from where he's devouring a carton full of donuts, not even paying heed to the rice meal that had already lost its warmth an hour into the meeting. At ease, Lieutenant, Sengoku allows, and the soldier drops his salute. The Fleet Admiral looks a little annoyed at having their meeting interrupted, and the way the soldier sweats informs them that the soldier is anxious to bear the brunt of Sengoku's ire. We're holding a very important meeting right now, Lieutenant, so you'd better have a good reason for barging in, he says, voice tight and firm. Sir, there's a call on standby for Vice Admiral Garp on Den Den Mushi F-00, the Marine says, and all eyes are on Garp this time. Can't the call wait? Sengoku huffs, crossing his arms. Sir, no, sir, the Marine shakes his head. The man on the other line said it was an emergency and something about a Luffy being missing, he says. Garp stiffens at the mention of his granddaughter's name, together with the word missing of all things. Abruptly, he stands up, surprising the Admiral on his right. I have to take this call, he says, words clipped and straight to the point. Sengoku's eyes garp for a brief moment before he sighs heavily and shoos him away with hand motions. Go. I'm giving you 5 minutes. Garp nods, looking grateful. Lead the way, he tells the lieutenant senior grade before they're off to the communications room. A moment of silence occupies the air in the room, stressed to the point of awkwardness before Sengoku coughs into his fist. Let's continue on about the matter in South Blue, he says. All eyes are immediately on him and away from the carton of donuts that Garp had left behind on his seat. Eventually, after offering 30% of her food to the monkey, it decides that she's better off with it, because apparently, offering food to a monkey gets you adopted in the end. They arrive in a clearing after swinging from branch to branch through several dozens of trees, and she's absolutely relieved when her feet touches the ground. Clinging to a monkey as it practically flies through the trees about several meters from the ground has traumatized her of heights just a little bit, but before she can beat the ground, she suddenly finds herself bombarded by a horde of monkeys. She squeaks in surprise, of course, but other than that she stays perfectly still as they inspect her. A few tug on her short hair, some lift her arms and poke her skin, whilst the rest are more fascinated by her clothes to which they try to remove from her person. Once they're done inspecting her, they start inspecting her bag to which she merely shrugs the straps off her shoulders. Like the first monkey, they are immediately enraptured by the containers that contain her food. A few of the smaller ones waddle over to her, tugging on her shirt and pinching her in demand to open the containers. Their adorable eyes win her over, and before she knows it they're having a feast. She feels a bit bad for stealing food from Party's bar, then something dawns onto her train thoughts that makes her explode into fits of laughter at the irony of her actions. Here she is, feeling bad about stealing food and even sharing it, whereas the real Luffy wouldn't hesitate to do the former and would physically glower at the very idea of the latter. She feels regretful, however, when she sees the empty containers of food, and wonders how on earth will she survive this forest without food now. Sure, she can pick some fruits from the trees, but it's inadvisable especially when there are dangerous predators lurking around like that giant snake. Her worries are placated when a bunch of bananas are dumped into her lap, and her gaze snaps up towards the monkey that placed it there in the first place. She doesn't know how, nor does she begin to question why, but she can tell that this monkey is the same one who'd rescued her from the snake and had carried her off to this paradise of monkeys. It feels different from the rest, just as every monkey has a unique feel to it that she's never noticed until just now. Internally, she's freaking out over the fact that she can distinguish monkeys because holy beep, but she smiles gratefully on the outside. The monkey blinks back at her before it looks back down at the bananas. She laughs a little, already knowing what it wants, and gifts it one of her bananas. Here, she says as she hands over one that's the most yellow out of the bunch. You can have this for showing me your family. The monkey accepts it, its mouth having puckered out, before it runs off to show her gift to the rest of its friends. She watches as the monkeys interact with one another for a few more minutes, before she sets off to covering the containers and packing her bag with the bananas placed on top to prevent them from being squished underneath. She sighs heavily, feeling the events of today weighing down on her tiny shoulders, and she feels like crying because she hasn't found any of the herbs she needs to help Melissa. But she hardens herself, makes the wetness in her eyes be pushed back, transforms her insides into pure iron, and steels her back for what's to come, because she has to. There's no going back now, she tells herself. The way forward is the only path she can take right now. Apparently, one of the baby monkeys seems to have noticed her about to leave, for it leaps towards her and clings to the back of her shirt. Hey, she yelps, trying to pull the baby monkey off of her, but then she realizes that the other monkeys, both children and adults, are watching her moves sharply, and she stills instantly, recognizing a losing fight when she sees one. Posing as threat to the young where the adults are still about nearby would be a stupid move, and she's not as daring nor foolish as the original Luffy to put herself in such a dangerous area. I can't stay here, she says not only to the monkey clinging to her back, but also to the rest of them who'd welcomed her. The monkey clinging to her whines, and she shakes her head at it. I can't stay here, she repeats as she sits down and waits for the baby to remove itself from her. Fortunately for her, one of the adult monkeys comes over to unlatch the baby from her when it doesn't seem like letting go too soon. It cries out in protest, but with a warning snarl from the adult, presumably its parent, it shushes immediately and allows itself to be carried off whilst casting teary eyes at her. However, another monkey is holding onto her arm before she can leave, When she checks, she notices that it's the same one who'd saved her, and she smiles sadly at it. "I can't stay here," she repeats, and damn, how many times has she said that line today? "I have to go," she says as she peels of its fingers. Adamantly, the monkey holds onto the edges of her shirt instead, and it beeping bares its long-ass teeth at her. Inwardly, she's freaking the beep out because what the hell, where did the cute you go and why the beep is the scary you out? On the outside, she's sweating bullets, so really, no difference at all. No, she tries to say as sternly as she can, just as when she'd talked to her neighbor's dog when it refused to let go of her Lacoste bag, and Conan had been all teeth and snarls too like the monkey. "Let go," she says. "Well, pleads, because let's be real here. Please?" She tries. "I really have to go. I need to find some herbs to help my," here, she pauses, because what is Melissa to her? A guardian? No, she knows that Melissa isn't just that. Garp had handed her to Melissa, and all the elderly woman had done was complain, but not once has she told her to get out and not once has she ever screamed or hit her. A friend? No, Melissa wasn't just a friend. Friends didn't make sure that she was handed off to responsible adults to be taken care of for the day. Melissa was family, and the memories of Melissa, handing her warm milk when Makino was too busy serving the bar. Bringing her to the outback when she needed to go, teaching her how to read and write when she already knew how to. Reprimanding her about how a young lady should act, then going on about the best ways to prepare hangover remedies, complaining about Garp and Whoop Slap and Makino even if it was all half-hearted, grinning down at her with a few missing teeth and telling her what a smart little girl she was and how she would definitely grow up differently than how her fellow monkeys had. Floods through her brain as if a dam had been broken down. And then the ache in her chest is back, and she starts crying of all things for Pete's sake, but no matter how hard she tries, she can't stop the tears that flow over her fingers as she tries to rub them out. She wants to go home, but she can't because Melissa is sick and she's the only one who knows how to help. All of the monkeys are crowding around her wondering why there is water flowing down from her eyes. They tug on her clothes and pull on her hair, but it only makes her sob even harder because she wants Melissa and Makino to be here right now. Better yet, she wants her parents here right now. But you can't always get what you want, she thinks bitterly. The baby monkeys cry back at her, asking her in their own language why she's crying, and one of the adult monkeys howls at them to quiet down. By then, she's already given up on why and how she can even understand them. "I need to find the herbs," are the first coherent words that tumble out of her mouth, and they're pretty stupid, because what's the point of telling these monkeys what she needs when they probably don't understand her? But she needs comfort, she needs someone to tell this to, and this is the best thing she's got now. "I know how to help Melissa," she says between sobs and disgusting inhales with the snot of snot being blown inwards. "I'm a doctor for Beep's sake, and I've studied my fair share of herbalism, but everything I need is in a beeping drugstore an entire dimension away, and I've never gone out hunting for herbs before, let alone in a freaking jungle with killer animals in it," she rants emotionally, before she digs into her rucksack to pull out a piece of cloth just so that she could throw it into the ground out of sheer, albeit childish, frustration. "And I can't even tell anybody in our village about it, because I'm supposed to be 2 and I shouldn't know things like that," she cries, though she internally wonders what will she do if she gets home. Just hand over the herbs to Kokoi. Then what? Obviously the villagers would start asking questions, and if they found out that she wasn't really Luffy, then they might even burn her on a stake, and there goes Luffy's wonderful adventure up in smoke and down to ashes. One of the adult monkeys cry out in question, and she's too deranged and emotional to even think rationally by this point, so she digs out the papers she'd ripped out from Kokoi's notes and shows it to the assembled monkeys before her. "You see all these herbs? These stupid plants, and oh god, why did there have to be so many, but who cares because I know every single one of them. You see this pink flower? Yeah. It can be used to boost the immune system, which is the bomb for slowing down cardiovascular diseases, but it can also increase the risk of liver damage and woohee. But this artichoke here can counter it because it can lower cholesterol levels, while this milk thistle here can, help the liver freaking regenerate its functions if it's combined with a dandelion of all things." And then she goes on until she rants and explains and lectures and cries and laughs herself to exhaustion, then to sleep. "Hello?" is the first thing that manages to come out of Garp's mouth before a barrage of insults and curses are suddenly hurling out of the phone and into his ear. Wincing, Garp brings the phone away from his face and waits for a few minutes for all the snarling and hissing to quiet down before he brings it back. "Hello," he repeats patiently. "Who is this?" "Garp, you old bucket of worms," is the answer. "Oh, whoop slap. Nice to hear from you." Garp greets cheerfully, before the smile curving his lips vanishes into thin air and all that's left is the dark expression upon his face. "Now what's this about Luffy being missing?" he asks, keeping his expression, demeanor, and even his beeping hockey contained and unreadable. As Whoop Slap details their progress in looking for the lost and most likely kidnapped Luffy, Garp feels his control slipping through tendrils of rage and fury. "And my house? Have you checked it yet?" Makino has, but Luffy wasn't there. "How about the stables? She likes visiting the cows and horses there." "No sign of her there either." "How about the pier? She likes going there." "In the middle of the night, Garp? Have you or have you not, Whoop Slap?" "We checked, Garp. She wasn't there either." Whoop Slap exhales deeply this time. "Look, Garp. She left a note at the table, saying that she'll fix things but she might as well have been kidnapped for slavery and forced to write that note," he says. Garp stays silent for a few more beats before he questions in a low, throaty voice. "Fix things?" he asks, sounding confused. "Fix what, Whoop Slap?" The mayor of Fuchsia Village sighs heavily. "We're not sure, Garp, but we believe it has something to do with Melissa," he confesses. "You see, Melissa got sick a week ago, as in really sick. Sick to the point that she has something infecting her lungs and slowly killing her. Makino didn't take it well, obviously, but Luffy, we thought that she was too young to understand what was going on, and she wasn't showing any signs of depression so we thought that she was doing fine." He begins to ramble on. But I guess we were too blind to see that she did understand," he admits before sighing loudly. "Honestly, I should have known better that your granddaughter wouldn't be all sweets and giggles." And Garp's reaction to his friend's best substitute for an apology was to laugh. Loudly. "Huh. And you said Luffy didn't have any of the monkey genes in her," he croaks out with glee. "And Melissa? Sick. Huh. That old hag will get up in no time, just you wait and see." "I doubt that," Whoop Slap says grimly. "But we really need you here, Garp. If Luffy's missing, you out of everyone here have the best chance of finding her." There is a moment of silence on Garp's part before he answers. "I'll talk about it with Sengoku," is all he can manage. "You know the rules, Whoop Slap. I'm still a Marine and the only reasons I can get so much breaks is because I've done so much for the Navy and nothing big has come up yet," he says regretfully. Whoop Slap has nothing else to say, but the disappointment that he oozes can be felt through the phone. This is just like with Dragon all over again. He spits out ruefully before all Garp can hear is the sound of the dial tone that sounds more mocking as the seconds pass by. It's a low blow on Whoop Slap's part to mention Dragon of all people to him. The betrayal his son had exacted upon him had left a scar upon his heart that would most likely never heal. But Garp can't blame the old mayor. Garp, for all that he loves his family, isn't really a great family man. He would always be torn between his family and his duties as a Marine. Between who makes him happy, and what makes him happy, but he never really had to actually choose because the former had always been understanding of the latter and let him go. It was only when Dragon had come into his life when complications had risen up and he actually had to choose. In the end, Garp had made a choice. He'd always been told that he'd made the correct one, but it never really did feel like right one. He'd lost a son in the process, and he wonders if it was actually him who'd done the betraying and if the same scar on his heart was on his son's as well. Exhaling deeply, Garp gently places the handset back. The Den Den Mushi looks worn out, and he tells the nearest lieutenant currently handling communications to give the little guy some water. He pauses by the doorway on his way back to the meeting room, and another lieutenant nearly barrels into him in the process. Luckily, Garp grabs the poor man's arm before he falls flat on his ass. "'Es, sir?" The lieutenant stammers out, before he composes himself and delivers a sharp salute. "Sir, good morning, sir," he greets cordially. Garp just stares down at the other Marine. "'Es, sir?" The lieutenant stammers out again, unnerved by his superior's staring. And then, suddenly, a bright grin breaks upon Garp's face. "Would you mind delivering a message to Sengoku for me?" The lieutenant blinks, before he nods eagerly. However, once Garp has finished relaying the message to him, The lieutenant has paled to the point his complexion resembles a sheet of white paper, and he's none too sure if he actually wants to be the one to deliver such a suicidal message. "Bawahahaha. I'm counting on you, lad," Garp says, patting the other Marine on the shoulder, before he walks off. But instead of heading to the meeting room, where Sengoku and all the other Marines of 1-star rank or higher are most likely talking about something that's already on his desk in the form of a report that he had been too lazy to browse through, Garp takes a right and heads for the port, for where his trusty Melody would most definitely be anchored at. After all, he has a granddaughter to hunt for. She doesn't dream that night. Instead, her peaceful slumber is plagued by a nightmare that has haunted her for a good third of her past life. She doesn't expect the nightmare to follow her, never even thought about the possibility, because ever since she'd been reincarnated into this not-so-fictional world, she hasn't had a single nightmare aside from that one time when she was 7 months old and woke up screaming because of a particularly brutal one depicting the way she'd first died. Besides, she lost everything that was once hers when she died. No more nagging parents, no more eccentric friends, no more nosy coworkers, no more patients that she'd have to smile blindingly at, no more neighbors with angry dogs, no more comfy apartment, no more medical license that she'd worked more than a beeping third of her life for, no more proud reputation that she'd worked another third of her life for. In fact, she has no more anything. She couldn't even keep her previous body and live her own life somewhere hopefully far away from the deranged canon plotline. No, she just had to be stuffed into this new, fresh, admittedly cuter, and fortunately female body of the main character. Luckily for her, she was saddled with her past life memories in this new life. Maybe that was supposed to be a sign that she hadn't completely lost everything just yet. The nightmare that haunts her no longer terrifies her after the first 5 years of its arrival, and by no longer terrifies her, she means that it no longer results in her waking up in the middle of the night with a scream tearing its way out of her throat and her entire body covered in a sheen of cold sweat, but it does always leave her a bit shaken from the entire ordeal. But the nightmare itself, considering the circumstances right now, is pretty grim and foreboding, like a prophecy just waiting to happen, and she steels herself from what's to come once the endless abyss of darkness in her head makes way for a bright light that suddenly appears in her mind's eye. Fragments of a memory that she'd rather never recall fleet through her mind like a cinematic record, and she's forced to watch every single one of them. Of a small, 4-walled room with tiled walls and floors and the scent of ethyl alcohol wafting throughout the room. Of an immobile and slightly pale-skinned body lying atop a steel, cold operating table. Of a scalper, which gleams underneath the glare of the overhead light, digging into the torso of the patient and burrowing its way downward to create a narrow stream wherein red life fluids seep out of. Of skin being pulled back to reveal organs still pumping and functioning despite one of them being scarily bloated out with pus seeping out of one of its many infected sores. Of her, still young and fresh out of medical school to work on her residency, suddenly freezing up, her hands clammy and trembling ever so slightly as they hovered over the sterilized tools that she would only have to pass on for her first time participating in an actual operation. Of experienced surgeons yelling at her deaf ears to get it together and for this tool and that tool to be handed over to them. But the thing that impacts upon her the most is the feeling after having been forcibly pushed out of the operating room and replaced with a nurse who could do better than her. Nurses were fundamentally what helped make up a hospital. They were the go-to person if their assigned doctor wasn't there, but to be replaced by one was an insult to her pride. She didn't graduate from one of the top medical schools in the entire world to be switched out for somebody else. She hadn't been allowed to go back into the operating room for a week, but the talks behind her back, of how unprofessional she'd been, had lasted much longer. She'd learned a life lesson from that frustrating and embarrassing and most painful experience. That hesitation and unpreparedness led to the failure of an operation, so she'd learned to never be one of those two things. She'd learned that hesitating and being unprepared led to death, and she wasn't willing to lose Melissa because of that. Not yet, and maybe not ever. She'd failed a couple of times before, she was only human, after all, but at least she'd tried her best those times after her first operation. Besides, there were some cases that a doctor just couldn't cure. But now, she couldn't fail. She is jolted out of her unpleasant slumber by a high-pitched shriek that makes the one bubbling in her throat immediately die a painless death. She looks around wildly with wide eyes to locate the source of such a scream, takes note of the adult monkeys circled around her with their backs to her, and wonders what on earth is happening so early in the morning. A small cry near her catches her attention, and she looks down at her side where a baby monkey is pitifully curled up to. In fact, there seems to be about a dozen baby monkeys curled up against her and crying out small whimpers into her sides. "What?" she says aloud, confused beyond her wise years, only for a loud growl to capture her attention. Alarmed, she gently pushes the baby monkeys away from her so that she can pull herself to her feet and peek over the adult monkeys' heads to get a good long look of what's going on. The sight that she sees is one that steals the breath out of her lungs. Gasping, she covers her mouth with both of her hands to muffle the sound. Because there, beyond the bushes that she and the rest of the monkeys had been hiding behind, is a tiger. And no, it's not like any of those regular-sized tigers that she'd see in zoos, because God forbid there be anything relatively normal in this insane jungle. In fact, it's huge. Not like Godzilla huge, but still freaking huge. The tiger, which is probably twice the width of her grandfather and much taller too if it ever decided to stand on its hind legs, is crouched lowly upon the field of flowers. She clearly sees the powerful muscles hidden behind its coarse fur, and swallows thickly when she sees who it's facing. Her monkey, because what else can she call it, is crouched lowly as well, its thin tail flicking from side to side in mirror to the tiger's much thicker one. She can't see its expression with its back facing her, but she can guess from its hisses that it's pretty pissed off too. She flinches when the behemoth of a tiger rears its head back to let loose a roar so loud that earth itself trembles. The baby monkeys around her start to whimper even louder, but she shushes them as fast as she can in order to avoid attracting the large beast's attention. And then, much to her amazement, just as the beast lowers its head back, her monkey lunges forward for a clawed swipe before it backs off to a safer distance. The tiger yelps, and she's not kidding, because it yelps like a dog, before it's back to growling at the monkey. However, instead of staying in one place, it crouches down even further before it leaps with its mouth wide open to reveal the sharp fangs that glint in the same its sharp claws do. Being much smaller and quicker, her monkey easily dodges the attack before it could get crushed underneath the humongous tiger's weight. It's a pattern afterwards. Tiger attacks, monkey dodges. When tiger shows slowing down, monkey lunges forward to swipe it. However, after several minutes of this pattern going on, she can see that both mammals are starting to tire out. Both mammals are breathing heavily and their attacks are significantly weaker than before. The tiger's leap has a shorter distance, and the way her monkey dodges is sluggish at best. She can tell that if this continues on for much longer, then her monkey will surely lose if it doesn't flee. With about 100 plans circling in her head, she looks around for her bag and spots it on the other side of the clearing. Oh beep her. She can't possibly get to it in time if she goes around the entire clearing. Unfortunately for her, her best bet is to get to it by running straight through the clearing where a very large and very angry tiger could quite possibly maul her to death if it manages to snag her with its huge claws. With no other plan left, she doesn't need to be told twice. Sighing heavily, she waits for the right moment to dart out of the monkey's circle and instantly seizes it once the tiger is at its safest distance away from the bag with its back turned towards her. Not even bothering to take in a deep breath, she barrels her way past the adult monkeys and runs head straight into the clearing. She can hear the monkeys yowling loudly at her, but what's done is done and she has no other choice but to go through with what she has planned. She makes it halfway into the clearing when the tiger finally takes notice of her, and her rapidly beating heart lodges itself in her throat when her gaze meets the predator's sharp and hungrily glinting one. For a split second, she understands. Understands why the tiger is here in the first place. Panic. Where are they? Where are they? Where are they? Frustration, because why won't this monkey just die already? Anger. Why did you stop me? And full-blown murderous intent. She understands. And in that moment she understands, she falters in her run, making her a target for the tiger to all too easy direct its next attack on. Fortunately for her, her reflexes kick in and she manages to roll out of the tiger's way and land solidly upon the soles of her slippers. Her lungs are starting to hurt with how heavily she's panting, but she ignores the dull ache within her chest in favor of bolting away as quickly as she can to where her bag is. Through the blood rushing in her ringing ears, she can barely make out the furious roar that is meant for her. She berates herself for how idiotic she's been. Because rule number 1 of encountering a predator, never turn your back on one unless you're asking for a death sentence. She reaches her bag in record time and starts digging through it with a ferocious kind of determination for the weapon she'd snatched from the top drawer of Garp's desk. Just as she sees the tiger readying itself to pounce upon her once more from her peripheral vision, she grips her bag tightly and scampers off as far away as she can. She hears the tiger's roar of frustration and anger, which only fuels her with the drive to run just a bit faster and gives her the perfect idea to throw out all of the useless things out of her bag, which all coincidentally land none too gently upon the tiger's face. Fortunately for her, her new strategy makes it easier for her to look through her bag. Unfortunately for her, however, her new strategy angers the tiger even more instead of slowing it down as she's presumed. A gleam of metal from within her bag catches her attention, and just as her hand encloses around something leathery, she finds herself suddenly knocked down to the ground by a heavy and almost suffocating weight. She cries in pain right after her jaw hits the ground hard, but she silences herself when she feels the hot breaths fanning the back of her neck that makes goosebumps break out all over her skin in a really, really bad way. The tiger shadows her body with its much larger one, effectively caging her in between all four of its legs. She has nowhere else to run, and no way out of this unfortunate situation to save her life. She's doomed, doomed, doomed. She can both hear and feel the tiger's powerful chest rumble with a kind of vicious triumph that makes her tremble with fearful anticipation. But when she waits for the assuredly painful blow to her person, she realizes as she tenses up that she's still tightly gripping the handle of the Swiss Army knife. And that's when her thought process comes to a sudden halt as her body decides that it doesn't need a brain to protect itself. She caresses the smooth leather handle for a brief moment before she rolls onto her back with her arms swinging out and carrying all the power that she could muster in this one single attack. The blade of her grandfather's Swiss knife catches the ray of sunlight filtering in through the trees, and it gleams the caught light back into the tiger's beady black orbs as it slices through its right eye, allowing a considerate amount of blood to spurt out of the flesh wound and onto her face. The smell of iron immediately invades her olfactory sensors, but all she has is enough time to grimace before she's suddenly hauled out from underneath the tiger and thrown off to the side before the tiger has enough time to brutally crush her beneath its weight for inflicting such damage onto it. She gets a mouthful of grass and dirt, which isn't the best combination to have for breakfast, mind you, as she rolls across the field several times before coming to a rather jarring stop that has her disoriented for what amounts to a few minutes. Blinking out the dark spots in her vision, she looks at what has happened so far and realizes that her monkey had apparently been the one to throw her off to the side to continue its fight with the tiger. Only difference now is that her monkey seems to be winning. With a manic shriek, her monkey attaches itself to the tiger's head, its legs wrapped around the large feline's powerful neck. As her monkey raises one of its clawed hand in the air, she has enough time to beep in a deep breath before she's watching her monkey gouge into the bleeding wound she'd created. Naturally, the tiger roars out in pain and it tries shaking the monkey off of it. To its misfortune, the monkey formidably hangs on by tightly gripping onto the feline's fur with its free hand as its occupied one is pulling its claws out of the tiger's eye with an audible and sickening squelch. Though she has never really been an avid animal lover, she does feel bad for inflicting such pain on the tiger and just standing by to watch the monkey thoroughly pummel the feline's ass. But hey, it was a dog-eat-dog world and she'd rather not be the one whose bones were reduced to chew toys. Eventually, the tiger is soundly defeated once it stupidly decides to ram its head into a tree in a desperate effort to take out the monkey with it. The only hole in its plan was that it had never really thought of the possibility that the monkey would jump off of its back once it was too late to swerve away from the tree. She winces at the loud sound of skull hitting tree and watches as the tiger slumps down into a dead faint onto the grassy floor. Her heart is still beating loudly and she places a hand over her chest to help calm it down as she regulates her breathing, because a panic attack in the middle of a forest isn't the greatest of ideas. Afterwards, she notices that she's still tightly gripping the knife in her hand and she doesn't quite know what to do with it. Blankly, she stares at the blood coating the blade before she calmly wipes off the still warm life fluid with her shirt and flips the blade back into its sheath so that she could safely tuck it into the waistband of her underwear for safekeeping, and uses the inside of her shirt to wipe off the blood on her face. She has no time to panic about the very sight of blood when Melissa's palm has been coated with it for the past couple days. A gentle touch on her arm snaps her out of her musings, and she looks up to meet her monkey's beady black one. Once her monkey knows it has her attention, it tugs on the sleeve of her shirt and she's smart enough to understand that it wants her to stand up. Despite her shaky legs, she manages to pull herself up from the ground with her bag in hand. "Are you all right?" she asks, which was quite stupid of her since monkeys can't reply, but she's already scanning the monkey for any injuries. There are a few bleeding scratches on it that would probably need washing to avoid infection, but other than that it looks fine, if not just tired. The monkey tilts its head at her, eyes once again calculating, before it tightens its grip on her sleeve and proceeds to drag her off to where the rest of the monkeys had emerged from their hiding spot behind the bushes. A few of the adults are baring its teeth at her, and when she looks at their eyes she understands that they are simply mad at her for her insubordination when they had made it clear that she was to stay with the babies. The rest of the adults who aren't baring their teeth at her either tug her hair or pinch any uncovered skin on her. She hisses in pain when one of them pinches the skin of her sore jaw, and when she rubs the aching skin she's sure enough that an ugly bruise has already blossomed there. Eventually, once the fuss is over, all of the adult monkeys get to work as she's apparently appointed the position of babysitter for the little ones. Once she's sure that the baby monkeys have occupied themselves with her hair and clothes, she starts watching the adult monkeys to see what exactly they're doing. She's amazed to see that they seem to have separated themselves into groups. One is scavenging for fruits on the nearby trees. Another is carrying the hopefully not dead tiger out of their territory, whilst the last one is picking up the things she'd thrown. Ah, she can't help but murmur once the last group deposits her thrown items on the ground directly in front of her. Thank you, she says with gratitude, because they didn't have to and it was very sweet of them to do this for her. They merely coo at her in reply before they turn their backs on her to resume whatever work they have left. Later on, after the sun has set and the sky itself has turned dark with its glittering heavenly bodies the only things lighting up the forest, she rearranges the things inside of her bag for the fourth time and thinks to herself that she can't stay here forever. She has to go. Go get the herbs to make Melissa's medicine, go back to Fuchsia village where Makino and Whoop Slap and Melissa and Home are. But the question is, go where? She has no idea. She hasn't told the monkeys of her plan to leave, doesn't have to, because it seems they already know with the way they're trying to stuff her bag with as much as fruit as it can handle. The babies shriek at her to stay, pulling on her clothes as strong as they can, but their mothers bring them away and shush their cries with coos and bared fangs. She doesn't have to worry about baby monkeys chasing after her once she leaves though, because they're all nestled safely into the chests of their mothers and dreaming the night away. She and her monkey are the only ones awake right now, and she's trying to find it inside of her to say goodbye once and for all as she slings on her bag. I guess this is it, she says, turning to face the monkey. I don't think you'll understand this, but I'd like to say thank you. For everything. I hoped I had more food to give you guys, but I don't have anything else aside from the fruits you gave me, she admits. Just, take care of yourselves. Okay. Look after each other and don't let anybody get eaten, please. I hope we'll be able to see each other again in the future, she confesses. But for now, this is goodbye. I still have to help somebody very important to me, so I hope you understand that I'm not leaving because I don't want to stay here, but because somebody needs me more and I can't say no. The monkey tilts its head at her, its large eyes practically looking through the very windows of her soul, before its gaze fleets off to the side where the depths of the forest are located. And without a moment's hesitation, the monkey promptly latches onto her arm. Yelping, she stumbles back a bit from the sudden weight. Hey, let go. She hisses, shaking her arm to throw the monkey off of her, which only furthers the mammal to wrap its long tail around her neck and give it a tight squeeze that has her choking at the pain of both being cut off from air and from her throat being squeezed. Just as she starts to see black spots dancing in her vision, the tail loosens its painful hold on her yet still alarmingly stays wrapped around her neck. She breathes in greedily, thankful that her lungs have been inflated with air after what feels like a decade. Meanwhile, the little mother beeper that tired to kill her has the gall to even snicker at her expense. What the hell's your problem? She growls, thoroughly unamused. You just don't go choking people like that when they're about to leave, she scolds with a glare. The monkey merely grins back at her, canines gleaming from the moonlight. Though she's intimidated by the sight, she forces herself to grow a spine because she won't let herself be stopped by a monkey of all things. Even though that monkey had bested a tiger, mind you. She tenses up when the tail around her neck tightens, but only up to a degree that's firm and unrelenting yet not the very least painful. Confused, she inspects the monkey with a silent question in her head, and she understands when she looks into the monkey's eyes and finds the answer that she's looking for. It'll be dangerous, she warns. And I won't come back here after I find what I'm looking for. I have to go back to my home first and foremost, she rules in. In reply, the monkey merely detaches itself from her and lets out a soft screech before it runs off to the forest with no intention of waiting for her. Hey, wait for me, she cries as she too runs off into the forest and after the monkey. 4 more days pass and she finds herself actually surviving the jungle. She doesn't know if it's because she's just that lucky, or if the universe itself has been modified to be lucky for Luffy. Her companion, whom she now dubs Mamoru, has been extremely helpful and she knows that she would have been dead by now if the now genderized he hadn't stubbornly insisted on tagging along. He had taught her to nap every several hours since having a full sleep either during daytime or nighttime wasn't all that recommended in such a dangerous place where predators could be lurking in the bushes right next to them. With Mamoru, she doesn't have to worry about traveling on the forest floors anymore since he can easily carry her on his back as he flies from branch to branch, making it easier for travel and escaping. It's also been easier to find the herbs she needs with Mamoru by her side, since he seems to understand her description of several herbs up to a certain degree, and it also helps that he has a keen sense of smell, making it easier to scour other sources of the same type of herb they've managed to fortunately see scattered upon random places that wild animals had most likely trampled upon. And he also makes for an excellent bodyguard, judging by the wheezing sounds the larger than average wolf makes as Mamoru strangles it to either unconsciousness or death. She pretends to be oblivious to the scene happening behind her as she picks several hawthorn berries from a healthy bush. Hawthorn berries were well known for relieving heart conditions, such as increasing blood flow to the heart, improving cardiac muscle contractions, and it even had an arrhythmic effect that would help steady the heartbeat, provided that it was taken in proper dosages, considering that the side effects of dizziness, appearance of rashes, nausea, headache, heart palpitations and intestinal problems weren't the best of symptoms to gain. As she places the berries within the folds of banana leaves, she takes stock of what herbs she has gathered so far. Fenugreek leaves that would do great for relieving coughs if boiled into herbal tea, and the freshly plucked seeds of the fenugreek plant that would do well as a poultice once it was wrapped up in a cloth and warmed and placed over any aching muscles. The beautiful lobelia with its wonderful lobeline, which would stimulate the adrenal glands to produce epinephrine that would in turn relax the airways and allow easier breathing. Osha roots to help increase the circulation to the lungs and help calm itchy lungs. The chaparral herb with its yellow budding flowers and histamine response that would do well against allergic and inflammatory reactions, and many more such as some oregano, turmeric and etc. Okay, I'm done, she announces as she closes her bag. Mamoru unfurls his tail from the wolf's neck, and she winces at the audible thump the wolf's body makes as it collapses to the ground in a dead faint. Mamoru bounds over to her, looking refreshed. Oh, he croons innocently, his black eyes gleaming. At least you're putting your tail to good use on anybody but me, she comments blandly. Makino, a soft voice and a gentle touch to the back of her hand snap her out of her thoughts. With glazed eyes, Makino looks up at her longtime friend who's staring at her with worry etched deeply onto her features. Terry. She tests, not knowing if she's really dreaming or not. She hasn't been sleeping properly ever since Luffy had up and disappeared, and she would frequently dream about several things whenever she would suddenly succumb to rest in random times of the day on the bar counter. Things like Melissa coming down from the stairs, healthy and revitalized once again like before. Like Whoop Slap suddenly barging into the bar, exclaiming that he'd found Luffy. Like Garp coming home with Luffy in his arms, both monkeys grinning brightly at her. And like this as well, where her dearest friend would come home suddenly from her business trip to the Goa Kingdom. I heard the news, Terry says, dark eyes sad. How are you holding up? She asks. Are you real? Makino asks instead, and she can tell by the anguished expression on her dear friend's face that she'd just broken her fragile heart. Oh, Makino, Terry cries softly, looking close to tears as she wraps her arms around the barmaid's shoulders and brings her head close to her chest. Of course I'm real. Can't you feel this? Me right here, holding you? She asks, and Makino feels something inside of her break once again for who knows many times it's been. Terry, Makino whimpers, and the floodgates behind her eyes finally open up, letting a river of tears cascade down both of her cheeks and most likely soaking her best friend's blouse. It's okay now, baby girl, I've got you, Terry murmurs, pressing her lips to Makino's head. She's rubbing circles on the younger girl's back, soothe her the best she can. I shouldn't have left. I knew something bad was gonna happen, felt it in my gut the moment I entered Goa Kingdom, but I figured it was the just my period acting up again, she says, and the way she says it with a serious kind of heat in her words makes Makino laugh. I'm just glad you're finally back, Makino sighs softly as she returns her friend's embrace. Yeah, and I won't be leaving any time soon until Luffy's found and Melissa's back on her 2 feet, Terry says stubbornly before pulling away. I mean, look at you. You look like you just rolled out of your own grave. Have you been getting any sleep lately? Your eye bags are huge and you look like you haven't eaten anything in a week. No wonder Sokka was so worried. Terry unashamedly adds in, grinning down at Makino's bland look. Still not saying yes to him, Makino says as she pulls away from Terry. She ignores the exasperated look her friend shoots her as she dries her wet cheeks with a clean handkerchief. Besides, I don't have time to think about romance when I have a bar to manage, and Mistress Melissa and Luffy to worry about, she sighs loudly, sniffing. Tell that to me in a few decades and you're a spinster, Terry huffs, rolling her eyes. I'd rather be a spinster than some easily won woman, Makino retorts. Besides, the right man will come for me, even if it takes decades of waiting, and I'm already content with the people in my life right now, the barmaid says with a sigh, a sad smile stretching her lips. Terry raises an eyebrow at her dear friend, looking unconvinced, before shooing the barmaid away back up her room for some beauty sleep whilst reassuring her friend that she'll be the one to watch over the bar in her stead. There is a distinct sheen to the silvery brown trunk of the Arjuna tree as the sun's rays filter through the dense foliage and reflect off of it. It's a beautiful sight, in her opinion, because she'd never expected to see an Arjuna tree in her entire lifetime, never mind her unexpected second one. She crouches down low on the grassy floor, where a pile of bark had peeled off from the Arjuna tree can be found. She picks one up, inspects its pretty reddish-brown interior, and promptly breaks it into 2. The insides are clean, bare of any red ants, and she finds herself breathing out a sigh of relief. It's just her luck that the Arjuna tree has already molted this time of the year, and that its bark hasn't been picked off yet by any humans or animals. She wonders if she's really that fortunate, or if it's the work of the universe trying to appease Luffy's every adventure for the sake of some progress in the storyline. She breaks off a few pieces from the bark, just enough to fit in her bag, before she digs a hole in the ground next to the tree and buries the bark there. It wouldn't do to leave some valuable material behind for infestation. Besides, if anybody came out here, they'd be smart enough to see the unnatural patch of dirt in the middle of the grassy area.
I believe that's the last of it, Mamoru, she says to her companion, who lands next to her from where he was swinging on a branch.
Mamoru just coos adorably despite his killer tail whipping about behind him. Now, with all of the herbs she needs packed up safely and securely in her trusty backpack, she's able to go back home. Just as she's about to climb onto Mamoru's back, she freezes, a thought suddenly occurring to her. Her monkey companion seems to sense the turmoil happening within her, and he moves out from underneath her to check what's wrong. That was apparently the wrong move, because without Mamoru supporting her from underneath, she falls to the ground in a messy heap. Ouch, she hisses, rubbing her sore chin. This has been the second time this week, and she worries that there might be some permanent disfigurement if her chin continues to bear the brunt of any damage. But her chin is the least of her worries now, because once she goes back to Fuchsia village, what then? She regrets not making any contingency plans any sooner. Because once she arrives back home in Fuchsia village with a backpack full of herbs that would certainly help Melissa out, questions would arise from the minds of the citizens of Fuchsia village. Because how could a 2-year-old girl who had run away in the middle of the night survive a week in a dangerous forest? How could a 2-year-old girl diagnose Melissa's sickness when she had no prior medical education? How could a 2-year-old girl know what herbs to collect, much less understand the difficult terms used in the books of their village doctor? Because there was no way any ordinary 2-year-old girl could do that. It was improbable, a 0% possibility of that ever working out, unless the 2-year-old girl wasn't normal in the least. There was a possibility that she would be seriously regarded as a prodigy, but the seed of what if would have already been planted and would slowly lengthen its roots into everybody's mind until one day they would question her. Why are you like this? Then slowly, they'd come up with suspicions about her. That she wasn't 2 years old at all. That maybe she was some witch who had unfortunately possessed the body of Garp's granddaughter. Or probably somebody who had the ability to shapeshift and had taken the place of Luffy. Or maybe they'd guess right and say that she was actually decades older than the body she'd found herself shoved into. Until eventually she would lose the trust that she had worked so hard to earn from the villagers, would lose the image they had of her as an innocent, carefree toddler who was slightly accelerated compared to others, would lose everything. Because they'd find out. They'd find out that she was nothing but a liar, a trickster, a deceiver, somebody who never truly belonged, trying to fit in a world that wasn't even hers to begin with. And Luffy didn't want that. She didn't want to be an outcast yet again. She'd spent her entire high school life as one, and it wasn't the best ways to spend your high school life, if you must know. It was painfully obvious that her paranoia was acting up, and she couldn't really blame that crazy part of her mind for coming up with such outrageous ideas. Here, she wonders what the villagers would think if they ever found out what she really is. Would they treat her the same as always, with love and affection and gentleness? Or would they treat her with caution as one would do with a wild animal that they had no idea of how to tame? It makes her sad, for doubting the people who had a hand in raising her for the second time, but one could never been too sure, after all. She had seen the hideous side of human beings, seen the havoc and pain it had caused to those of lower class in society, or those who had no strong character to defend themselves or endure through the dagger-like words. If she doubts, it's only to protect herself in the end. And as she wallows in her miserable musings, a memory comes to light in her mind, one that has been hidden and pushed away for a much later time. "Do you really think I should have been born?" Ace's voice filters through her head, and she has so much to say to him. To tell a boy so young and lost as he is that he has every right to exist, that the son should never shoulder the parent's sins, that he will be so loved and wanted that so many would die for him. But she can't, because that would lead to disrupting the entire plotline at such an early time where canon has yet to truly unfold. And yet, there's a small and nearly silent whisper that murmurs to her from the back of her mind. "Haven't you disrupted things already?" And she has. She's beefed up the entire storyline by being born as a she instead of a he, and she sincerely doubts that the original Luffy had gone trotting off to the forest to find some herbs for Melissa, considering the fact that 1. He was 2 freaking years old, and 2. He hadn't studied herbalism like she had. Which leads to the most famous question: should she screw canon even more, or let things roll by? Unfortunately for her, it doesn't seem like she'll be making the decision herself, because a shrill cry pierces through the once deceiving quietness of the forest and makes her snap out of her thoughts to see what on earth is going on this time. Oh, for the love of umbrella-wielding Totoro! There's another human in this forest aside from her. Another human who is currently under the mercy of Mamoru, who in turn is gleefully, judging by his manic grin, choking the poor, small man with his deadly tail. "Mamoru!" She cries out, rushing forward to push the monkey off. She freezes, however, when the monkey bares its fangs at her, and remembers that Mamoru is no tamed house dog but a free and wild creature. "Put him down, Mamoru," she says, this time in a softer voice, as she levels her gaze directly to Mamoru's. She neither tilts nor lowers her chin. She is his equal, for all their difference in species. He's helped her as she's helped him. She wouldn't have survived in this jungle if it weren't for him, and he would have lost more in his fight with the tiger if it were not for her. Mamoru continues baring his fangs at her. Nonetheless, his grip on the intruder's neck loosens somewhat. Something gleams from the man's waist, and when her eyes land on it, she understands why Mamoru has reacted so violently. The man has a short sword. Although it is sheathed safely by his side, the hilt of the sword's gleam is unavoidable, and she remembers the way her Swiss knife had gleamed right before it burrowed its way through the tiger's flesh. Mamoru had seen it, her knife. Of course he had. He'd been right there afterwards to save her from the tiger after her reckless move. He remembers it too. Remembers its effectiveness and clear threat to any who it's being used against, because why else would his beady black eyes be so full of fear and kill before it kills you, as he holds onto the man as if his very life depends on it? Because it does in some way. He's only protecting himself in the end, just as she's protected herself with woven lies. "Drop your weapon," she commands, eyes flicking to the short man's eyes. "He won't stop until you do," she tells him. The man, who looks about ready to piss himself, struggles to untie the sash around his waist as quickly as he can whilst being suffocated. The yellow sash drops to the ground alongside with the short sword. It takes a few more moments before Mamoru's dropped his hold on the man's neck. When he does, Mamoru is suddenly beside her in a flash, his terrifying tail wrapped snugly around her arm. She watches as the man struggles to recompose himself. The slight bluish pallor to his tanned skin is starting to fade away as he greedily beeps in deep breaths of air to make up for what's been lost. He's short, probably twice or thrice her size in length, with a white turban covering his hair if he has any. His head is weirdly shaped, and because of that he looks like Stewie from Family Guy, complete with glaring eyes that are solely trained on her. But she doesn't mind the glare. She's dealt with enough glares in her life, most that are much scarier than his, that she's practically immune to it. What's most important, however, is his fashion sense. That jumper, she points out, gaze trained on the ugliest jumper she's ever seen. It's a horrid shade of pink with violet polka dots. It looks as if a rainbow had vomited on it, tried to clean up the evidence with a wet rag, gave up and just cried sorrowful tears. It is horrendous. What's wrong with it? The man? Or is it boy? But no, the Adam's apple in his throat and the small scuff of hair growing on his chin is evident enough to show that he's a man. Asks, looking down at himself. You got a problem with it? He scowls darkly. You should burn it, is what she wants to say. Instead, she puts on an indifferent mask. I've never seen one like it before, she says, vomiting out lies whilst what goes on in her head is I wish I'd never seen one in my entire life. Oh really, the man says, eyeing her suspiciously. Learn to control your pet, by the way, he says, casting a glare at the monkey. But he shrivels back almost pathetically when Mamoru glares right back at him. Keep it on a leash, will ya? Little bugger nearly killed me. Luckily for it I wasn't in a murderous mood, the man says, trying to boast though it fails ridiculously, before he adds. Or I would have gutted it. This time, it is her who bristles. Mamoru's a he and he's not my pet, she retorts. And I'd like to see you try to take him down, she says pointedly, chin tilted up haughtily. The short man glowers darkly at her, before he shakes his head in what seems to be apparent yet reluctant acceptance. Kids these days don't even know how to respect their elders, he sighs deeply, looking almost like he's sulking. How old are you anyways? 5, 6. And what are you even doing out here? He barrels off. That's none of your business, she answers curtly. The man opens his mouth, ready to deliver a probably smart remark, before he pauses and seems to sniff the air. You smell like a doctor, he states, before his gaze darts to the bag on her bag, which is brimming with freshly collected herbs. Are you a doctor? He tentatively asks, eyeing her with suspicion. Her heart jumps to her throat just once at that question, and it takes a lot of willpower for her to pretend that there is no storm raging on inside of her. Maybe, is the unexpected answer that tumbles out of her mouth a little bit too quickly. Seriously, kid. It's a simple yes or no question. Are you or are you not? The man asks her impatiently. I don't care how old you are, or if that pet of yours is a serial killer or something, or if you are, but if you know how to treat somebody, I'm interested. She eyes him suspiciously, backing off a few more feet. My grandpa told me not to go with weird old men, she says, frowning disdainfully. In fact, he told me not to go with any kind of male. The man sputters aloud. Instead of it rushing towards his cheeks, the blood drains away from his entire face until he's a shade paler. No? That's not. What the beep? Why would I? He huffs out loudly after his momentary breakdown. Look. A friend of mine has been sick for the past few days and I don't have the belly to even pay for an Edgetown doc. I'm really desperate here, so if you have any kind of brains for medicine, I'd really need it, he finally finishes. She furrows her eyebrows. A few days of sickness? That was certainly something to be alarmed about. This friend of yours, has he been having a fever for the past few days? She asks. Yeah. And he's been bleeding through the nose and vomiting since 5 days ago, and he's recently gotten a big rash on his arm that we had to wrap up lest he'd scratched the skin off. Mother of sweet potatoes. If she thinks what she thinks this disease is, then this man is in some serious shit. Any severe headaches? Muscle pain? Irritation behind the eyes? She asks rapidly. Yeah, the man nods. Do you know what's wrong with him? He asks. Take us to him. She ignores the man's question. At the man's befuddled silence, she fixes a firm look on him. We don't have time to spare. If this man has what I think he has, then he'll need a proper doctor. Soon, or else he might die if we wait around and treat it like an ordinary fever, she snaps, adjusting herself on Mamoru's back as the monkey wraps a tail around her waist to secure her. The man's eyes widen in shock, a look of terror fleeting across his features before a mask of cold seriousness covers it up. With stiff shoulders, he nods. Okay, he agrees, before he turns on his heel and runs off. Surprisingly, he's quite agile. If Mamoru wasn't carrying her, then she'd had lost him not even a minute later. Shorty. She's not exactly the most creative with names, okay. Eventually leads them to a house that looks more like an impressively large shack. She and Mamoru cautiously pad after Shorty, and she takes in everything she sees. She spots a larger than average living room that most likely poses as the dining room as well, and she must say that there are a few interesting things around that look to have come from nobles, and she tries her very best not to curl her lip once she sees the numerous empty bottles of alcohol scattered about. She doesn't exactly hate alcohol. She's a huge fan of it, or as much as a doctor her age can be without looking like some drug addict on her next shift, but it's the mess it leaves both physically and mentally that annoys her. Shorty doesn't comment about the condition of the room. He just leads them to a hallway where there are several doors on either ends. They stop in front of the third one on the left, and Shorty turns to face her with dark eyes that don't quite meet her own. He's sleeping in there, he says. Hasn't been conscious in a while, but that's good, right? Because whenever he's awake, he's only in pain, he informs her. She doesn't say anything, but does take note of that. Shorty quietly opens the door for her. She takes a brief moment to take all that is Luffy. The brightness in such darkly colored eyes, the natural upward curve of lips, the unsteady hands, and bundles it up to temporarily store in the back of her head. When she enters the room, she's her again, with her sharp yet tired eyes, lips pressed together into a firm line, and hands that won't ever shake, and she breezes towards the patient. The man is large with slightly dark skin that looks to have come more from his Latino blood than from being hours out in the sun. True to Shorty's words, the man is suffering from a high fever that has left a reddish pallor to his skin as his immune system struggles to wash it out through sweat. She checks his pulse first. It's weak, but it's clearly there and beating at an accelerated speed that is definitely not normal. Has he eaten anything? She asks, inwardly bemoaning over the lack of a stethoscope. I tried feeding him this morning, but he spat it on my face, Shorty grimaces. Lack of appetite, huh, she murmurs as she checks his eyes, whose sclera are pinkish, and the dark bags underneath it could point to a lack of sleep from shivers. Tell me he's at least drank something. Glass of water but nothing else today, Shorty says. She feels her shoulders slump at that. One of the most important factors of healthcare was making sure that the patient stayed hydrated at most if not all of the time. Could you go and fetch me at least a jug of water? He needs to be hydrated as soon as possible, she requests. And do you have any more blankets? This is too thin for him, she informs him, because despite there being a thick comforter wrapped around the big guy, he needed more. We do. Just let me get them in the back, Shorty says before he scurries out of the door. She barely hears the sound of the door opening and closing behind her, too focused on the patient before her. She remembers Shorty mentioning a rash on his friend's arm, and when she goes to check both arms, she sees that the left one has bandages wrapped around it from the wrist to the elbow. She carefully unwinds the wrappings, and she whistles at the alarmingly large rash that dots across his skin in angry red marks. She doesn't comment about it. Instead, she winds the wrappings back and securely knots it just as the large man flinches and groans out loudly. Her eyes flicker over to the man's face, and she watches as his features scrunch up with the signs of waking up whilst she pulls the comforter over him. The man's eyelids flutter open and glassy, dark eyes stare up at the ceiling before they unfocusedly settle upon her. The man furrows his eyebrows as he squints, his cheeks flushing an even deeper shade of red from his fever and from the strain he's probably forcing himself into. Dogra, the man croaks out, his breathing labored. I see Sleeping Beauty has finally awoken, she states blandly. How are you feeling? She asks. The man blinks dazedly at her, before his eyes flicker to the right and he stares blankly for a good minute. Bucket? He tiredly asks. Bucket? She voices aloud, before she looks around the room for said bucket. She spots the aforementioned object in a corner too far away from her, and she looks over to Mamoru. Mamoru, sweetie, can you get that for me? She requests. The monkey does so. He picks up the metal object, goes over to her, and hands it to her awaiting hands. When she looks into it, she sees that it's suspiciously empty, but the nose-scrunching smell that wafts from its insides tells her what exactly it had been used as. Okay, she cringes, because it's been far too long since she's handled this, and sets down the bucket. Let me help you sit up, and she does. It takes quite a lot of effort with his big mass and her tinier one, but eventually she has him half sitting up. Here you go, she says, handing over the bucket to him. The man promptly lowers his head and releases his insides into it. Let it all out, she coos as she rubs comforting circles on his back, counting how many times he's vomited. After the 6th outtake, the man leans away from the absolutely horrendous smelling bucket, which she gingerly takes and places on the ground right behind the bed's headboard. Not a moment later, the door bangs open and in walks in Shorty, who's carrying a pile of blankets with a jug of water balanced precariously on the top. Amazingly, he manages to set it all down on the table in the middle without affecting the wobbly stack. When Shorty finally looks up, he notices that his companion is awake and his eyes go platter-sized wide. "Magra!" Shorty exclaims, hurrying over to his friend. "Are you feeling any better?" he asks. The man, Magra, stares dazedly at him. Dogra, he names, and she decides that Dogra is a much better name than Shorty. "My stomach hurts," he grumbles as he lies back down on bed and promptly cocoons himself into the sheets. "That's 'cause you haven't eaten anything today," Dogra retorts. "Here, drink some water." "Doc said you'd need it," he says as he picks up the jug of water and hands it over to Magra. Magra barely takes 5 sips before he hands it back, looking thoroughly worn out from the entire ordeal. Magra is asleep in seconds, if his thankfully even breathing is anything to go by. She and Dogra get to quick work in bundling up with the piles of blankets brought. When they're done, she wastes no time in digging into her bag of herbs for what she needs to relieve the itchiness and most likely pain coming from the rash. "Is it just the two of you here?" she questions, not only for small talk but also for just in case of anybody else getting infected. Dogra freezes, and the look he sends her is suspicious and cautious. "How curious. Look, I don't have the necessary equipment or medicine to treat Magra right now, so our best bet is to get to my village as soon as possible. We have a doctor there who barely asks for payment from anybody, and I'm sure he'll be happy to help you provided that you and your friend remain civil," she explains to him. "So if there's anybody else here, it'd be best to quarantine. Well, make sure that they all stay out of Magra's room or else they'll get the same sickness that he has," she points out. Dogra continues eyeing her badly for a coup more seconds before he stubbornly looks away from her. "It's only us, the boss, and the kid," he finally answers. "Boss?" she questions aloud, and it takes her a moment to connect the puzzle pieces together. Why the man had a short sword in the first place. Why he and his friend lived in the middle of the mountain. Why the heck they couldn't pay for a simple doctor when they had all these interesting stuff they could pawn off for money. "Oh my god, don't tell me you're mountain bandits," she says, looking at him with pleading eyes, because how could have she been so stupid and careless? If this is where the Dayton family lives, she swears she'll go right out and choke a bitch. His silence is confirmation enough. "You see why I couldn't get a doctor from Edgetown?" He scowls bitterly. "None of 'em would ever help any of us mountain bandits unless we pay them a hefty price." "Oh my gosh, you are mountain bandits." She feels like crying. She honest to God feels like crying because what the hell? What the beeping hell? She didn't beeping sign up for this. Didn't beeping sign up to help some sick mountain bandit. Luffy is supposed to hate mountain bandits, and here she is helping one and most likely revealing her secret affinity for medicine. But we stopped all that pillaging years ago 'cause we got caught." Dogra tries to fan out the flames he'd caused. "Oh god. Oh god. Oh god. Who caught you?" she asks, feeling her voice go a pitch higher as she feels her heart beat faster and faster until it's practically beating the speed limit in her city. Dogra grimaces. She closes her eyes. Dogra opens his mouth. She tries to mentally prepare herself. Garp the hero did. A bemoaning wail slices through the air, causing a few tropical birds to fly out from the foliage of the trees nearby. To be continued, and thanks for watching.